You are listening to another episode of the Dynamic Podcast. I'm your host, DJ Dell 523. Oh yes, this is my first podcast of 2021. And you know what? With everything going on right now, at first I thought I was just going to do something on what was going on in the Capitol, and that would have been easy, and I think I will talk about that later. But right now, I'm going to do something a little more lighthearted here. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about sampling and how it's affected artists and the music industry on a whole. For anyone who doesn't know, sampling is when you take a person's music from the past, or just a different person's music in general, you incorporate a piece of that into the song that you're doing at the moment. So a lot of times it can be a verse, it can even just be an instrumental interlude, it can be anything really. And that's what sampling is. Now a lot of times it's more obvious, especially if it's a song that people really recognize, but in a lot of cases it can be a lot more subtle. And one of the things that I find is that in the past, this was often criticized, and people who didn't really know much about it or weren't necessarily in the rap industry or whatever would oftentimes belittle it. They would put it down and they would just say that this was just an idea of just stealing people's music and there was no creative backing behind it and it was just unoriginal. Well, we've come to find out more recently that that's not the case at all. And the thing is, you can really tell that there is a lot of talent behind it, and to be able to take a piece of music and essentially reimagine it, because it's not just as simple as just literally just taking a line from a song and the beat behind it and just playing that and talking over top of it. There's more to it than that. There is actually an art to recalibrating the music to the sound, to the point where a lot of times, even if you recognize the song itself, the sound of that clip does not sound the same as the original song it came from. There's an art to it. Now, in the past, one of the things that was big with sampling is you had a lot of artists who were a little bit sore about it and didn't like the idea of sampling at all. Now, one of the reasons why they didn't like it, because at first there was a time where the proper recognition, if you will, wasn't necessarily being paid to the artists or the writers of the original song. So someone might take a clip from a song but wouldn't necessarily go through the proper channels to let the artist know that they were using it, so then that way they could get royalties off it as well. And that created a problem, but that's since been rectified for the most part. But the other problem was you had a lot of old school artists out there who just didn't like the idea of their music being used. Now, that was until the money came in, which was a big factor in why it's bigger now. Because a lot of the artists who originally were from the old guard, if you will, who just didn't like the idea of these young whippersnappers, if you will, taking their music and profiting off of it, until they actually realized that, wait a minute, I got royalty checks coming in now. And you know what? I haven't performed this song in 30 years, and now all of a sudden I'm getting a paycheck again for it. Maybe this isn't so bad. Maybe I should look into this and, be a little more open-minded about it. The other thing that I would say with that as well is, for myself, I've always been a fan of music. Even before I started DJing and hosting my own show and whatnot, I've always been a fan of music, and I've also been a fan of the history behind the music, because I'm just a natural history fan in general, so that kind of stuff always interests me. So whenever I would hear an album of my favorite rap artists or hip-hop or R&B artists where something was sampled, I would always check the liner notes to see where the parts of that song that were sampled were originally from, and to the best of my ability, I would go and search out these artists, you know what I mean? And at the time that I originally started doing this, I would just go to record stores, because at the time, internet the way it is now, it wasn't like that then. So you really didn't have the internet, and when you did, you didn't have all the forums and whatnot, and YouTube and things like that make it a heck of a lot easier to find artists nowadays back then. So it was more of a challenge, but I enjoyed the challenge. And I will tell you that for myself, I do an R&B show on the radio every week, and I basically play a lot of old school retro R&B and jazz. That being said, a lot of the artists that I play and a lot of the artists that I have in my album catalog, I wouldn't have if it weren't for sampling. Simply put, the fact that I heard a hook in a song that I thought was pretty catchy, or I liked the melody or whatever, and I looked in and say, oh, okay, well, you know what? I'll give you an example here. There's a song from Jay-Z back in the day, the Girls, Girls, Girls. I remember that I really liked the hook of that song, and I looked in the liner notes and it said this is an interpretation from a song from Tom Brock. And I'm like, oh, I never heard of Tom Brock at the time. So I went to our local record store, looked him up. He wasn't there, but then they were able to order an album from him. So I bought the album and I listened to it, and I'll tell you, I really enjoyed the album. And come to find out, he had worked with Barry White in the past. He only has one album to my knowledge, but the fact is, I would have never found out about him at all, and I would have missed out on some good soul had I not looked at the back of those liner notes because of the sampling. So I bring this up because there's a lot of artists out there who have directly benefited from artists sampling music, because what it's done, especially for some of these old school artists, it has brought a resurgence of popularity for these artists, because other people like myself will hear a hook and be like, wow, who is this from? And especially nowadays where it's a lot easier to do this, because you can just go on YouTube or whatever, or All Music or Shazam, and you can find these things out in seconds. Whereas for me, looking up one song like that might take me a couple of weeks or a couple of months, depending on how hard it was to find the information. But because of that, these artists are getting newfound recognition. Like, these guys haven't been relevant in decades, and all of a sudden people are looking for their music again. And the funny thing is, it's not even people from their generation that are looking for it. It's younger people who are looking for their music. So I say all this to say that sampling is huge, and even for the people who have put it down and tried to belittle it and say, well, it's not being original. Well, it is being original, because you're taking a piece of music and you are redefining it. In a lot of cases, if it wasn't for that research or looking up on YouTube or whatever that person's done, that old school artist would still be sitting in obscurity. But instead, it has brought newfound attention to these artists. And in a lot of cases, you have artists out there now who are touring on old school circuits, or even have put out new material as a result of people looking for them because of sampling. I think this is something that is an important part of music, and it's funny how things have evolved, because at one point in time, this was something that was kind of looked down upon, but now a lot of artists are embracing it and are actually hoping that people will sample their music, because especially if they wrote the song themselves, if the music is sampled, they're getting a paycheck and they don't even have to do anything. And the funny thing is, a lot of times with a lot of the music that I've found this way, the songs that are being sampled aren't even the best known songs from these artists. A lot of times they're obscure songs that are buried deep within the album that, unless you were a person who actually owned the album, you might not even know about the song at all. But they sample this song, and then people like the song, and then they turn around and they'll look for the artist. So to me, sampling is actually beneficial for everyone. Not only that, but it's kind of like putting a different spin on a classic recipe. Sometimes it doesn't work, absolutely. Sometimes you'll change it up a little bit, and then you realize that, you know what, the original was better, or you should have just left it alone. But then other times you realize that, hey, this is actually a good thing. This is what I find, that people sampling music or rediscovering music is always a good thing, because to me, it just shows that the music was appreciated to begin with. Because if there was nothing redeeming about the original source material, then no one would look for it to try to sample it, And if the person didn't sample it, then those residual checks wouldn't be coming in. So all in all, it benefits both sides. And I would encourage anyone who's listening to this that, you know what, I know that a lot of people don't necessarily buy albums the way they used to, although you can still find the liner notes online to newer albums as well. I would encourage you to look at those liner notes and see where the song came from. And you know what? It may be a little bit of a history lesson, but guess what? A lot of times you'll find new great music that you wouldn't have found otherwise just by doing a little bit of research. So that would be what I would say to you. That would be my little tidbit of advice, if you will. Try it, and you know what? You'll probably like it. Anyway, that's all I got to say about that today. I thank you for listening, and I will be getting on to some serious topics too, but I figured just to start off the new year that I would start off talking about some music, just have a little conversation about something that wasn't about the world going to hell in a handbasket. Anyway, with that being said, I am DJ Dell 523. I thank you for listening to my dynamic podcast. I'll see you again soon.